The air smelled different. It wasn't the metallic tang of gunpowder or the stale scent of crowded bunkers. It smelled like fresh-cut grass and clean, damp earth. It was May 1945, and for Gretchen Schultz, the scent of the American Midwest was the scent of defeat, and yet, confusingly, of peace. Gretchen was 24, but the war had aged her face into the firm mask of a woman twice that. She had served as an anti-aircraft gunner for 4 long years. Her hands, once soft, were calloused and strong, used to swinging heavy barrels and feeding endless belts of ammunition. Even now, after months of retreating and the final crushing surrender, she stood taller than the other women clustered around her. She was a soldier to the bone, and even in surrender, her backbone refused to bend. She was among the first groups of Feinfrauen, enemy women, to be shipped across the Atlantic to a new kind of prison camp in the United States. They had been told stories, grim tales of starvation and cruelty handed down by propaganda ministers. They expected the worst: cold cells, meager rations, and endless work. They were ready for it. They were ready to endure. Endurance was all they had left. The train groaned to a halt. They were somewhere in Ohio, near a quiet, forgotten place the Americans called Harmony Creek. An American officer, tall and perfectly starched, stood waiting. He was accompanied by a platoon of young American GIs who looked less like hardened warriors and more like farm boys who missed their mothers. The contrast between the relaxed, well-fed Americans and the weary, hollow-eyed German women was stark. "All right, ladies," the officer shouted, his voice ringing with a strained, almost forced cheerfulness. "Welcome to Camp Harmony. Get 'em off the cars, Sergeant!" Gretchen was the first out, her worn uniform stiff with dirt and pride. She adjusted the collar automatically, a meaningless gesture of discipline. She scanned the camp. This was not a prison. The compound was surrounded by 2 fences, yes, but the barracks were freshly painted white. There were neat rows of green lawn. She saw laundry lines billowing with impossibly white sheets. And the sound? The sound was birdsong, not air raid sirens. Inside the compound, they saw a large wooden building with windows. A mess hall, perhaps? Through the windows, she could see bright lights and what looked like tables covered with checkered cloths. It was surreal. It was clean. It was comfortable. The other women, from nurses to auxiliary staff, began to whisper and look around with stunned, wide eyes. This was the first shock. The war was over, but this luxury felt like a trick. The officer who had welcomed them walked over, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself without a smile. This was Captain Dale. He was younger than Gretchen, maybe 22, but he carried the weight of a man who believed himself to be on the moral high ground. He looked at Gretchen's proud posture, at the dirt and grease stains on her tunic, and a sneer touched his lips. "You," he said, pointing his clipboard at her. "You look like the boss. Name?" "Gretchen Schultz, Captain," she replied, her English formal and precise. "Former flak regiment," Captain Dale laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a short, sharp bark that made the younger American soldiers shift their feet uncomfortably. "Flak regiment." "You were shooting at our boys, were you, Schultz?" he drawled. He dropped his voice, making sure only those closest could hear the insult. "Looks like your aim was as weak as your whole little army." "A gunner, huh?" More like a glorified maid in a uniform. The insult was calculated, meant to sting her pride. It was not just an attack on her fighting ability. It was a mockery of her service, her sacrifice, her very strength. He was dismissing her gender and her soldier's identity in one cruel sentence. The blood rushed to Gretchen's face, but she held her stance. Years of discipline had taught her that emotion was a weakness, a luxury she could not afford. She looked straight into Captain Dale's eyes that were full of tired superiority. "Captain," Gretchen said, her voice clear but low, devoid of any heat, "I followed my orders and defended my home, as you followed yours. My aim was excellent. But war is not about single shots. It is about supplies, and yours were better. You won. I am your prisoner. You may inspect me now." She offered no apology, no sign of shame, only the cold, hard logic of a defeated soldier. Captain Dale was momentarily taken aback. He'd expected tears, or perhaps a shouted defiance he could easily crush. He hadn't expected the quiet dignity of a person who knew exactly who she was, even in rags. His face darkened. "Get her to processing, Sergeant," he snapped, regaining his composure. "And make sure she understands the rules. There will be no military attitude here. This is a detention camp, not an officers' club." As Gretchen was led away, she noticed two things. First, the American sergeant leading her avoided Captain Dale's eyes and gave Gretchen a glance of brief, shared awkwardness. Second, she looked back at the barracks, the white sheets, and the green lawn. A detention camp, she thought, the simple English phrase repeating in her mind. If this is punishment, what was the life we were fighting for? The insult still burned, but the shock of the place, the comfort, the cleanliness, was far more confusing, far more unsettling than any barbed wire or cold cell could have been. The battle with Captain Dale was only beginning, but her real war, the war against despair and the shame of defeat, had just received its strangest weapon, comfortable American captivity. She would be underestimated no longer. She would use the quiet of this strange, peaceful prison to observe, to plan, and to endure until her strength was recognized one way or another. The journey for justice, and perhaps a deeper truth about the war, had begun right here, on the soft grass of Camp Harmony. The initial processing was quick, efficient, and almost bizarrely polite. They were given clean, simple clothes, a sort of shapeless, dark blue uniform, and led to their barracks. Gretchen Schultz found herself in a room designed for 20 with actual individual cots. Not straw piles on the floor, cots with thin but clean mattresses, and a pillow. She hadn't slept on a real pillow in 2 years. The true bewildering comfort of Camp Harmony began to sink in during dinner that first night. The German women were marched to the mess hall. They expected soup, thin, watery, filled with the flavor of despair. Instead, they were served a meal that would have been a feast back home: roast beef, mashed potatoes, and green beans. Real green beans, not the canned industrial kind. There was fresh white bread and even a small, waxy apple for dessert. Gretchen watched the others. Some ate too quickly, a primal fear of scarcity driving them. Others stared at the food, mistrustful, as if the meat might have been poisoned or the bread might turn to ash in their mouths. Gretchen, ever the soldier, ate slowly and deliberately, taking in every detail. The room was well lit. The walls were a pale yellow. There was no shouting, no rush, and certainly no threat of violence. An American cook, a huge man with a kind, round face, even gave a shy wave from the kitchen window. "They are trying to fatten us up for the slaughter," whispered a young woman named Inga, who had been a telephone operator in Berlin. "No," Gretchen said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. She wiped her mouth with the clean, rough napkin. "If they wanted us to starve, they would let us starve. If they wanted to kill us, they would have done it on the dock. This is the truth of it, Inga. They have enough. They have more than enough." The realization was a punch to the gut. The entire war, the starvation, the rationing, the endless propaganda about the brutal, dying enemy, it all seemed to crumble in the face of a simple, fresh-baked roll. It wasn't just the food. It was the entire atmosphere. The rules were mild. No leaving the compound, lights out at 10, and mandatory attendance at daily supervised work details. There were no forced marches, no harsh physical punishments. Gretchen refused to be softened by this strange, deceptive kindness. She knew comfort was corrosive. She saw the other women immediately fall into idleness, sleeping late, gossiping, or simply staring at the walls, exhausted by the sudden lack of fear. "We are soldiers, not refugees," she told herself. "We must keep our order." She began to institute a covert routine. She didn't announce herself as the leader. She simply acted like one. In the mornings, while the other women were still stirring, Gretchen was up. She made her bed with hospital corners. Then she moved quietly through the barracks, organizing. She asked women to clean their areas, not as a command, but as a suggestion for efficiency. "A clean bunk is a clear mind, Lotta," she told a tired-looking nurse. "We lost the war, but we will not lose our dignity. That is the only territory left to us." She started small, organized reading circles in the evenings using the surprisingly well-stocked camp library, mostly donated American novels and history books. She insisted they keep up their physical fitness, leading a quiet, controlled series of exercises. Behind the barracks, calisthenics that barely disturbed the American, guards but were physically demanding enough to remind the women of their military past. Her quiet strength began to resonate. The women respected her discipline. She was fair, never cruel, but she demanded effort. She was the only anchor in their bewildering new world. They started calling her Die Eiserne, the Iron One, not with fear, but with a growing reliance. One afternoon, during a work detail of sorting supplies, Gretchen had an emotional beat that cracked her strong exterior. They were unloading boxes of medical supplies. A civilian volunteer, an older woman with silver hair and gentle eyes named Mrs. Peters, was supervising them. Mrs. Peters noticed Gretchen's hands, the deep, rough calluses. Mrs. Peters didn't speak German, and Gretchen's English was limited. But kindness needs no translator. Mrs. Peters simply opened a small tin she was carrying and offered it to Gretchen. It was hand cream. Simple, white, scented with a light rose fragrance. Gretchen froze. During the war, such a thing was unthinkable, a luxury for the very rich or an impossibility. She had not even thought about her hands being rough. They were simply tools. "For your work," Mrs. Peters said softly, gesturing to Gretchen's cracked knuckles. She smiled, a smile full of uncomplicated human compassion. She wasn't smiling at an enemy soldier. She was smiling at a person with sore hands. Gretchen looked down at the tin, then back at the woman. The simple act of kindness, divorced entirely from strategy or war, hit her harder than any shell shock. It made her eyes sting. She fought back the urge to cry with the same fierce determination she used to fight back an enemy plane. "Thank you," Gretchen managed to say, the words thick in her throat. She took the tin and tucked it into her pocket, suddenly feeling deeply ashamed of her military hardness. This was the ultimate confusion. She had expected to fight, to hate, to endure. Instead, she was being confronted with cleanliness, enough food, and simple, overwhelming human kindness from the very people she had been trained to kill. This soft life was a new kind of enemy. It threatened to wash away their discipline, their identity, and their sense of purpose. But Gretchen would not allow it. She would use the comfort to strengthen her mind, and she would hold on to the hand cream as a reminder that the world was far more complicated than simple black and white. Meanwhile, Captain Dale, observing from his office window, saw Gretchen leading the women in their rigorous, self-imposed exercises. He saw the respect the others gave her. He interpreted her continued discipline not as dignity, but as defiance. He didn't see a woman holding on to her sense of self. He saw a threat, a remnant of the defeated enemy spirit that needed to be crushed. He clenched his jaw. This glorified maid was going to be trouble, and he knew he had to break her spirit before it could spread. As the weeks turned into months, the routine of Camp Harmony settled into an almost domestic monotony. This was the deeper injustice, the one that wounded Gretchen more than Captain Dale's mockery, the way they were being treated as children who needed coddling, rather than as soldiers who had fought with conviction. Their work details were always benign: laundry, gardening, light housekeeping for the base offices. Never anything that required a real skill. Gretchen, who had overseen the maintenance of complex anti-aircraft weaponry, was now folding handkerchiefs. The efficiency and precision she brought to the task were dismissed as overzealousness. The camp's dismissiveness was a constant, low-level thrum of disrespect. They were not seen as equals, even in defeat. They were simply a problem to manage, a group of women who had played dress-up in uniforms. Gretchen, Die Eiserne, found an outlet for her frustration and her protective instinct. It happened during a mandatory language lesson. The instructor, a nervous young civilian, made a joke about German efficiency that fell flat and was perceived as condescending by one of the women. A proud former signals operator named Marta, tired and homesick, snapped. She knocked over a stack of books and refused to pick them up, saying in broken English, "We are soldiers, not children for your funny lessons." The instructor panicked and called Captain Dale. When Captain Dale arrived, Marta was sobbing uncontrollably, her brief moment of defiance replaced by pure exhaustion. He looked at Marta with cold contempt, then immediately focused on Gretchen. "Schultz," Captain Dale said, his voice hard. "I know you are behind this attitude. You are the ringleader. Pick up the books. Then you will face a disciplinary hearing." Gretchen did not argue. She saw the fear in Marta's eyes. Marta couldn't handle the punishment. Gretchen saw her opportunity. She began to calmly and precisely stack the books. "Captain," Gretchen said, not looking up. "The books fell when I opened the window to let the heat out." Marta was simply startled. "If a punishment is required for breaking the routine, I take full responsibility. I was distracting her." It was a blatant lie, but it was delivered with such controlled conviction that it threw Captain Dale off balance. Gretchen's action wasn't merely protective. It was a defiant act of sacrifice. By accepting the blame for a minor infraction, she protected her comrade and showed the American officer that she had a code of honor he could not touch. Captain Dale saw his chance to finally crush her. He decided to not only punish her, but to restrict the freedoms of all the FWPs. "Fine, Schultz," he sneered. "You get 3 days solitary confinement. And effective immediately, all outside activities are suspended. No more exercise, no more reading circles. You will sit and reflect on your continued defiance." This was the injustice Gretchen truly hated, the punishment of the many for the supposed defiance of one. Meanwhile, Gretchen's strength had not gone unnoticed by everyone. A new face had appeared at Camp Harmony, Eleanor Vance, a civilian administrator from the American military headquarters in Washington. Eleanor was in her early 50s, a sharp-eyed woman with a sensible dress and a mind full of questions. She was there to assess the effectiveness and ethical compliance of the German FWP camps. Eleanor was objective. She didn't see enemies or heroes. She saw facts. She saw the neat barracks, the abundant food, and the mild rules, the comfortable life. But she also noticed the subtle psychological decay. She saw the idle hands and the vacant eyes. And then she saw Gretchen. Eleanor observed Gretchen's punishment. She watched as Gretchen was led to the small, separate confinement hut. She saw Gretchen walk with the same rigid, unbroken discipline as she had on the day of her arrival. Eleanor went to the barracks to question the other women about the incident. Gretchen did it to protect Marta, Inga explained in faltering English. "Marta is tired. Gretchen is never tired. She says we must maintain Ordnung, order in our minds, or we will lose everything." Eleanor looked at the perfectly made cots, the small, organized personal effects. She noted the hand cream tin on Gretchen's bedside table. She realized that the self-imposed discipline of the women, led by Gretchen, was a desperate attempt to maintain their sanity and dignity in the face of what they perceived as a demoralizing, infantilizing comfort. Eleanor also observed Captain Dale. She saw the way he mocked Gretchen, the subtle but distinct disrespect in his eyes when he talked about the Feinfrauen. She realized the injustice was not in the camp conditions, but in Captain Dale's refusal to recognize them as legitimate professional soldiers, however misguided their cause. He is trying to break her by dismissing her strength, Eleanor thought, writing rapidly in her notebook. He thinks comfort will make them weak, but her discipline is making him angry. That evening, Eleanor approached Captain Dale in his office, where he was looking smugly at the empty exercise yard. "Captain Dale," Eleanor said, her voice polite but firm, "I am noting in my report that Private Schultz's confinement seems excessive, especially since the incident involved no violence and was a momentary lapse from a woman under extreme duress." Captain Dale bristled. "With all due respect, Miss Vance, you don't understand the German mind. They understand force. They respect command. That Schultz woman is dangerous. She's too proud. She's trying to establish a chain of command in my camp. She has to be dealt with before she corrupts the others." "Or perhaps," Eleanor countered gently, but her eyes held steel, "she is simply trying to maintain the discipline that allowed her to survive a war. And perhaps the true injustice, Captain, is not how much food we give them, but how little respect we show for their sacrifice, even in defeat." Captain Dale stared at her, his face turning red. A civilian administrator had just challenged his authority and his worldview. The underlying tension of camp harmony, the conflict between American condescension and German dignity, was now set to erupt. Gretchen was locked away, but her spirit, and Eleanor Vance's watchful eye, were still very much in the game. The stage was set for a major test. Gretchen was in the confinement hut, a small, dark wooden shack detached from the main barracks. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting upright, using the isolation not as punishment, but as meditation. She was cleaning her mind, preparing for whatever Captain Dale would throw at her next. Suddenly, a sound cut through the oppressive silence, the frantic clang of a fire bell, not the camp's gentle bugle, but a loud, urgent siren from the nearby town of Harmony Creek. Then came shouts, distant and panicked, and the sound of truck engines roaring to life. Through the tiny mesh-covered window, Gretchen could smell smoke. Not the usual smoke from the camp incinerator, but wood and burning tar. It was a serious fire. Gretchen knew that Camp Harmony often housed overflow supplies and secondary repair shops for the larger military base miles away. A fire here could be catastrophic. Inside the compound, the American guards were thrown into chaos. They were trained for security, not for emergency response. Captain Dale could be heard yelling conflicting orders, his voice tight with panic. Then, Gretchen heard something else. The familiar sound of a nearby generator sputtering and dying. The camp's water pumps, which relied on that generator, were now useless. She pounded on the door of the hut, her discipline momentarily giving way to urgent reality. "Guard, the main pump generator is down. It's the auxiliary feed line. It always fails under high pressure," she shouted in perfect urgent English. A young guard opened the hatch, confused. "What? How do you know that?" "I know mechanics. I was responsible for an entire battery's power grid." "Get the captain!" Captain Dale arrived, sweaty and furious. "Get back." "What are you doing, Schultz?" "Captain, the generator is the old German model captured in Italy. It has a faulty fuel line safety. If you do not bypass it now, you will lose the main water tank. You need to connect the external emergency pump, and I know exactly where the access panel is. It is on the north wall, disguised as a pipe stack." He stared at her, his mind torn between his hatred for her and the terrifying sight of black smoke pouring from the northern perimeter. He saw her competence, her calm, decisive voice slicing through his own panic. "Open the lock," he barked to the guard, against his better judgment. "But if this is a trick, Schultz, you will rot in here." Gretchen didn't hesitate. She ran to the pump house, followed by Captain Dale and two bewildered GIs. The fire was spreading fast, having started in an old storage shed full of oil drums. "The valve key is locked inside," one GI yelled, pointing to a heavy metal box. "No time!" Gretchen grabbed a heavy iron bar lying nearby. Her strong, calloused hands, the same hands Captain Dale had dismissed as belonging to a glorified maid, slammed the bar against the lock mechanism twice. The lock burst open. "You!" She pointed to a soldier. "Go to the women's barracks. Tell my women, tell De Eiserne's women, to use the laundry buckets and form a line from the kitchen cistern." "Now, hurry!" Her order, sharp and pure, cut through the noise. The GI, completely stunned by her authority, didn't question it. He ran. Gretchen focused on the emergency pump. She saw the faulty German-made bypass valve immediately. It was a common flaw she had fixed 100 times under fire. She ignored the leaking fuel line, found the right wrench, and with practiced, powerful movements, engaged the manual override. Ka-chunk! The heavy pump sprang to life, coughing and then roaring. Water pressure surged into the camp hoses. The GIs, now armed with powerful streams of water, began fighting the blaze. But they weren't enough. From the barracks, the German FWPs poured out. The young GI had delivered Gretchen's message, and they obeyed De Eiserne instantly. They didn't wait for American permission. They formed a tight, efficient line, passing heavy, sloshing buckets of water from the kitchen cistern, a secondary supply, to the fire line. Their movements were precise, disciplined, and shockingly fast. The well-rehearsed choreography of people who had been trained for wartime efficiency. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. The German women, the supposed enemy, fighting a fire to save an American camp. They worked harder, faster, and more cleanly than the panicked American base staff. The fire was contained. The storage shed was gone, but the nearby main mess hall and the barracks were saved. Thanks entirely to the instant, organized response led by a woman who had been locked in solitary confinement. In the aftermath, Captain Dale was silent, his face gray with soot and humiliation. He had seen the truth. He had seen a soldier act, and he had been shown up by her competence. But the rules were the rules. Later that evening, after the ashes had cooled and the American officers had gathered to debate what to do, Captain Dale pointedly ignored Gretchen's heroism. He focused on the only thing he could. She broke the terms of her confinement, he stated, his voice trembling slightly. She led the other prisoners out of their barracks without permission. This cannot be ignored. The regulations are clear. She must be punished. He wanted to charge her with a serious offense, insubordination and inciting a breach of security. Gretchen stepped forward, still covered in soot, her hands raw from the iron bar and the firefighting. "Captain," she said, her voice heavy with weariness but unbroken, "the women left their barracks on my direct order. The American Guard simply delivered my message. They saved your camp because they are disciplined soldiers, not because they are disobedient prisoners. I take full and complete responsibility for the entire operation, including the breakage of the lock and the unauthorized movement of the other fine Frauen. Charge me with everything." She made the sacrifice. She used her strength to shield the others from his wrath, daring him to punish her for saving his base. Gretchen's honor and courage were now undeniable. But the punishment was coming, and Captain Dale was determined to deliver it, not because she was guilty, but because her competence was an offense to his pride, unseen. Eleanor Vance, the American administrator, had watched the entire event from the corner of the administration building. She hadn't only watched the fire. She had watched the captain's face, and she had watched Gretchen's ultimate sacrifice. Eleanor's report was now being written, and it would contain a truth far hotter than the fire itself. The following morning, Gretchen Schultz was brought before a hearing board. This was not a military court, but an internal administrative review. Yet the stakes were clear. Captain Dale, flushed with a vengeful dignity, was determined to see Gretchen given the maximum penalty, extended harsh labor, and permanent restriction of all privileges. He needed to reassert his authority and bury the shame of being rescued by a woman he had called a glorified maid. The board consisted of 3 older, sober-looking officers and, notably, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was there not as a judge, but as an official observer. Though her presence carried significant weight, Captain Dale presented his case first, focusing entirely on the broken rules. "Private Schultz's actions were an egregious breach of security," he stated, adjusting his perfectly neat collar. "She broke a lock, she left confinement, and she issued unauthorized, military-style orders to other prisoners. We must look at the intent, not the result. Her intent was to prove herself superior, and that kind of defiance cannot be tolerated in a prisoner of war camp." The officers listened, nodding. "The military mind values order above all else. Private Schultz," the presiding officer, a kindly-looking major, said, "You have heard the charges. Do you deny that you broke the lock and issued orders?" Gretchen stood straight, her soot-stained uniform a badge of honor in the clean room. "No, Major, I do not deny it," Gretchen said. Her voice was strong, carrying no hint of apology, only conviction. "I broke the lock because the American soldiers were panicking and the key was not available. I issued orders because I recognized the failure point of your generator and the speed of the fire, and no one else was giving clear direction. I am a soldier. My training compels me to act when life and property are threatened, regardless of whose uniform I am wearing," Captain Dale scoffed. "She talks about training. She was trained by the enemy. Her training is nothing but arrogance, Major." The major hesitated, clearly caught between the letter of the law and the saving of the camp. It was Eleanor Vance's turn. She opened her notebook, her eyes fixed on Captain Dale. "If the board will permit," Eleanor began, her tone professional and calm, "I would like to present the full context of Private Schultz's actions and the full context of Captain Dale's administration." Captain Dale went pale. "This is irregular, Miss Vance. My mandate is to review the ethical and compliance standards of this camp, Captain. Eleanor replied, not looking at him. It is entirely regular. She spoke clearly, avoiding judgment, sticking only to facts that she had quietly gathered over weeks. She spoke about the mild conditions, the comfortable life, which, while well-intentioned, often led to a psychological breakdown among the women because their sacrifice and discipline were being erased. Then, she focused on Gretchen. Private Schultz has been systematically underestimated and mocked by Captain Dale from the moment she arrived, Eleanor stated. The captain, in his initial exchange, openly referred to her as a glorified maid and dismissed her service. He confused her disciplined maintenance of routine with defiance. His punishment, solitary confinement for a simple argument, was clearly an act of personal malice, designed to crush her pride. She paused and looked at Gretchen. Yesterday, Private Schultz acted not to prove herself superior, but to protect her comrades from further collective punishment, Eleanor continued. She took the blame for a rule-breaking that was, in fact, an act of heroism. She sacrificed her own remaining liberty to ensure that Captain Dale could not punish the 20 other women who were following the efficient, life-saving orders of a true commander. Eleanor then pulled out a small, worn piece of paper she had found tucked into a Bible in Gretchen's belongings, left behind before her confinement. It was not a military document. It was a partial diary entry. Eleanor read it aloud. "We have nothing left but our honor," the entry read. "We must hold on to our order. If they give us cleanliness, we will use it to cleanse our spirit. If they give us food, we will use it to build our strength, not our idleness. The war is over, but the fight for self is not." The silence in the room was heavy. The major looked at Captain Dale, whose face was now a sickly, mottled red. Gretchen hadn't fought for an ideology. She had fought for her own sense of honor and duty. Her discipline, which Captain Dale saw as defiance, was actually her redemption. Captain Dale refused to see a soldier, Eleanor concluded, placing the diary entry on the table. He only saw an enemy to be humiliated. But when fire came, Private Schultz acted like the finest soldier any of us has seen. If you punish her for saving your lives and property, Major, you are admitting that honor and selflessness are less important than the arbitrary pride of a single officer. It was the emotional climax. Gretchen had sacrificed herself for the others, but Eleanor had sacrificed her own neutrality to expose the truth. The burden of the decision now fell upon the major. The confrontation was complete, and Captain Dale's quiet, hateful injustice had been dragged into the light. The silence following Eleanor Vance's statement hung in the air like smoke. The 3 officers on the board looked from the diary entry to Gretchen, and finally, with profound discomfort, at Captain Dale. They were men of honor, and they could not punish a soldier who had just demonstrated the highest form of military duty, selfless action, and taking responsibility for her subordinates. The major cleared his throat. "Captain Dale," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "your actions concerning Private Schultz have demonstrated a severe lack of judgment and a failure to maintain professional objectivity. This will be reflected in your official record. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your command at Camp Harmony and reassigned to administrative duties in another sector." Captain Dale swallowed hard, his face a mask of defeat far more complete than Gretchen's had ever been. He didn't look at Gretchen. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his starched uniform suddenly seeming limp and empty. His injustice had been exposed, and his career was over. The major turned to Gretchen, his expression now one of profound respect. "Private Schultz," he said, "the charges are dismissed. Not only that, but your service during the fire will be officially commended in the camp log. Your request for additional, meaningful work, commensurate with your skills in mechanics and organization, is approved. You will be placed in charge of the camp's maintenance and supply organization. It wasn't freedom, but it was far better. It was the highest form of justice Gretchen could have hoped for. Respect earned. She was no longer a child to be managed, but a professional to be utilized. Her strength had been seen and validated by the very nation that had defeated her. Gretchen simply nodded, her eyes shining with quiet relief and dignity. "Thank you, Major. I will ensure this camp operates with the highest efficiency." Over the next few months, Camp Harmony transformed. Under Gretchen's quiet, disciplined supervision, the German women found purpose. The efficiency they brought to the base was remarkable. They fixed the camp's troublesome generator, reorganized the supply depot into a model of military precision, and even started a serious farm-to-table gardening project to feed the camp. The comfortable life became, paradoxically, the source of their strength. They used the safety, the good food, and the clean surroundings to heal, to think, and to reestablish their self-respect through meaningful work. They had lost the war, but Gretchen ensured they did not lose themselves. The twist, the exposure of truth, and the legacy, Eleanor Vance completed her official report to Washington. She detailed the strange, almost unbelievable truth of Camp Harmony. She wrote about the roast beef, the clean sheets, and the relative comfort. But more importantly, she wrote about Gretchen Schultz, the brave, underestimated soldier who had turned that comfort into a battleground for dignity. Eleanor included the story of Captain Dale's cruelty, Gretchen's sacrifice, and the final powerful earning of respect. She recognized that the true power of the American camps was not in harshness but in their surprising humanity, which had shocked the German women out of the propaganda they believed. Eleanor's report, titled The Paradox of Camp Harmony, became a key document used by post-war planners. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the fact that the enemy was often just a fellow human being driven by a profound, if misguided, sense of duty. Years later, long after Gretchen had returned home to help rebuild her devastated country, and long after Camp Harmony was just a memory, Eleanor Vance retired. She took her old research notes, the transcripts from the hearing, and the stories of Gretchen and the Feindfrauen, and wrote a book. The book wasn't about the defeat of Germany. It was about the dignity found in the aftermath. It told the story of the brave German women who found comfort so jarring that they had to work harder to maintain their honor. It told of how Gretchen Schultz, the gunner called a glorified maid, used the abundance of the enemy to rebuild her soul. And one day, an old man in a quiet Midwestern town, now 60 years past the war, would sit down and see a title flash across his screen, a title inspired by Eleanor's book, a title that captured the shocking, paradoxical truth of the time.